The glass slipped from the billionaire's hand and shattered across the marble terrace. Crystal fragments scattered like fallen stars across the warm stone, catching the Mediterranean light in 100 tiny explosions. But it wasn't the sound that broke him. It wasn't the champagne fizzing against the ground, or the startled glances from nearby guests, or the waiter who lunged forward with a towel. It was the faces. 2 boys, no older than 8, standing on the lower terrace of the most exclusive yacht club on the coast of Monaco, barefoot and breathless and laughing, with faces that looked exactly like his jawline, his eyes, his chin, his expression, staring back at him from 2 children he had never met, never held, never known existed. And standing behind them, one hand on each of their shoulders, was the woman he had walked away from 9 years ago without ever looking back. Have you ever made a choice so devastating that it didn't just change your future, it erased an entire life you were supposed to live? Have you ever walked away from something, convinced you were being strong, only to discover years later that what you abandoned had been growing, breathing, waiting, without you? This is the story of Dominic Ashford, a man who conquered industries, who bent markets, who built an empire so vast that the financial press stopped trying to measure it. A man the world called brilliant, visionary, unstoppable. But this is not a story about what he built. This is a story about what he destroyed, and whether it was too late to rebuild it. What happens next between this man and the woman he left behind? What happens when those 2 boys look up at him and ask the one question he has no answer for? Will either break him beyond repair or give him the one thing his billions could never buy. Stay with me until the end, because the twist in this story is something you will absolutely never see coming. And if you believe that some mistakes, even the unforgivable ones, deserve a second chance, go ahead and hit that like button right now. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Infinite Love Tales by Mr. White, because this story is about to take you somewhere you won't forget. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. Dominic Ashford didn't walk into rooms. He altered them. At 41 years old, standing 6'2" with steel gray eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from magazine covers, he carried the kind of presence that made people straighten their posture before he even spoke. Forbes had featured him 11 times. Time had put him on the cover twice. The financial press had given up trying to rank his net worth and simply referred to him as the architect of the impossible. And they weren't wrong. Ashford Technologies had reshaped entire industries: biotech, clean energy, artificial intelligence. His algorithms powered hospitals in 14 countries. His renewable energy patents had made him more money in licensing fees alone than most nations generated in GDP. By every metric the world used to define success, Dominic Ashford was the definition. But metrics don't measure what matters. On this particular afternoon, he stood on the upper terrace of the Riviera Maritime Club in Monaco, one hand resting on the marble railing, the other holding a glass of sparkling water he hadn't tasted. Below him, the harbor glistened, a fleet of yachts so polished they looked like they'd been painted onto the sea. Staff moved between tables, arranging flowers, adjusting linens, preparing for the annual Solaire Gala, an invitation-only affair that attracted the wealthiest names in Europe. Dominic was this year's keynote speaker. His assistant, Marco, had confirmed the guest list twice, the seating arrangements 3 times, and the speech notes 4 times. Everything was perfect. Everything was controlled. Everything was empty. He checked his watch, not for the time. He always knew the time. It was a reflex, a habit, the compulsive tick of a man who had measured his entire existence by productivity and output, by acquisitions closed and margins optimized. He ran his life the way he ran his company, with ruthless efficiency and zero tolerance for anything that didn't serve the bottom line. But 6 months ago, something had cracked. It was his 41st birthday. He had been alone in his penthouse in Zurich, a sprawling glass cathedral overlooking a city that worshipped him but didn't know him. No calls that mattered. No voice he wanted to hear. He opened a bottle of Bordeaux that was meant for 2 people and drank it alone, sitting in a chair that cost more than most people's cars, staring at a skyline that reflected everything he owned and nothing he loved. That night, for the first time in years, a name surfaced. Not in his thoughts, those he could control. It surfaced in the space between waking and sleeping, where discipline has no jurisdiction, and the heart speaks in the language the mind refuses to translate. Lena. He had buried that name deep, encased it in concrete, and sunk it to the bottom of a decade's worth of deals, flights, boardrooms, and victories. And for 9 years, it stayed there, silent, still. But ghosts have a way of catching up, especially the ones you created yourself. And on this particular afternoon, at this particular club, in this particular city, the past didn't knock. It walked right in. To understand what happened on that terrace, you need to understand what happened in Paris. Because that's where this story really begins. Not in a boardroom or a penthouse. In a gallery 10 years ago, on an unremarkable Tuesday evening that would rearrange the rest of Dominic Ashford's life. He was 31, already wealthy, already relentless. He had flown to Paris for an investor showcase, a gallery opening featuring emerging artists whose work was being positioned for private collections. Dominic wasn't there for the art. He was there for the asset valuation. He moved through the gallery the way he moved through everything, analytically, efficiently, already calculating returns before the first glass of wine was poured. And then he turned a corner and saw her painting. It stopped him, physically stopped him, which, for a man who hadn't paused for anything in a decade, was seismic. The canvas was large, 6 feet wide, 4 feet tall, and it pulsed with color. Abstract, raw, unapologetic, reds that bled into golds that shattered into deep, aching blues. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't polished. It was alive. It looked the way heartbreak sounds. The way longing feels at 3 in the morning when the world is asleep and you are not. He stood in front of it for 11 minutes. He knew because he checked his watch afterward, stunned that time had moved at all. You've been staring long enough to owe me a conversation. He turned, and there she was, Lina Moreau, 27 years old, half French, half Brazilian, dark curls falling past her shoulders, eyes the color of espresso with flecks of gold that caught every light in the room. She was holding a glass of cheap wine in one hand and a paintbrush, still wet with titanium white, in the other. She had a smudge of cerulean blue on her collarbone. She was chaos. He was control. They shouldn't have worked. They talked for 4 hours. She challenged every assumption he had about success, about value, about what it meant to build something that mattered. She said his world measured everything and felt nothing. He said her world felt everything and measured nothing. She laughed, a sound that cracked open something in his chest he hadn't known was sealed. By the end of the night, he knew she was different. By the end of the month, he knew she was dangerous. Because she made him feel. And for Dominic Ashford, feeling was the one variable he had never learned to manage. They spent 2 years together. 2 years of Paris apartments with tall windows and tangled sheets. Late-night conversations that wandered through philosophy and pasta recipes and childhood wounds. Arguments that ended not in silence but in honesty. The kind of honesty that strips you bare and somehow makes you stronger. Mornings that felt like gifts. Evenings that felt like home. She softened his edges. He gave her stability. They were imperfect. They were real. They were the best version of each other. And then one night, everything changed. It was raining. The kind of Paris rain that turns the city into a watercolor. Soft, relentless, blurring every hard line. Lina was standing in their kitchen, her hands pressed gently against her stomach, her eyes shining with a hope so fragile it could shatter at the wrong word. She looked at him and said 2 words that should have been the beginning of everything. I'm pregnant. Dominic felt the floor shift beneath him, not with joy, with fear, raw, primal, suffocating fear, the kind that masquerades as logic, the kind that builds arguments out of panic and calls them reason. He didn't shout. He didn't slam a door. He did something far worse. He spoke with cold, measured precision, every word a calculated incision. I'm not ready. This wasn't part of the plan. You can't expect me to rearrange everything. He reduced the miracle growing inside the woman he loved to a disruption in his calendar, a variable that didn't fit the model, an inconvenience. Lina stared at him, not with anger, not yet, with the slow, dawning horror of a woman watching the man she loved reveal who he truly was beneath the tenderness and the late-night promises. She asked him to choose. He chose the only thing he understood, control. The next morning, before the sun crested the rooftops of the 6th arrondissement, Dominic packed a single bag. A car took him to Charles de Gaulle. A flight took him to London. A meeting that couldn't wait, or so he told himself, consumed the rest of his day. He drafted emails on his phone as the plane climbed above the clouds, each keystroke putting distance between himself and the woman sitting alone in an apartment that still smelled like his cologne. He never called. She never reached out. Pride and pain built twin walls, one on each side of a silence that stretched across days, then weeks, then months, then years. 9 of them. 9 years of absence so complete it calcified into permanence. He told himself it was for the best. He told himself she'd move on. He told himself he didn't think about her. Every single one of those things was a lie. 9 years. That's how long Dominic Ashford ran from the only moment in his life that truly mattered. But the universe has a sense of timing that no billionaire can buy. And today, on a sun-drenched terrace overlooking the Mediterranean, his debt came due. The laughter reached him first. Not the polished, curated laughter of club guests, the kind that came wrapped in discretion and measured by social appropriateness. This was different. Raw. Wild. Uncontained. The kind of laughter that belonged to skin knees and summer afternoons, and the absolute unshakable conviction that the world was made for running through at full speed. Children. At the Riviera Maritime Club. That alone was unusual. This was a place designed for adults who had forgotten how to play. Dominic turned casually, mildly curious. 2 boys were chasing each other along the lower terrace, weaving between wrought iron tables and towering potted palms with a reckless joy only childhood possesses. One had a toy sailboat tucked under his arm, clutching it like a trophy. The other was lunging for it, barefoot, his laughter rising in breathless bursts. For a moment, just a moment, Dominic felt something he couldn't name. Not amusement. Something warmer. Something that ached. Then the boy with the sailboat turned and looked up toward the upper terrace, squinting against the sun, grinning with breathless triumph. And the world beneath Dominic Ashford's feet dissolved. The jawline, the shape of the eyes, the slight cleft in the chin, the way the boy's dark hair fell across his forehead in a wave that refused to be tamed. It was his own face. His exact face at that age. Not a resemblance, not a similarity. A mirror folded across time. The glass slipped from his hand. It hit the marble railing and exploded, crystal fragments spraying across the terrace in a starburst of reflected light. A waiter flinched. 2 guests turned sharply. Dominic didn't register any of it, because the second boy had stopped running too. He stood perfectly still, looking up at Dominic with an expression of cautious curiosity. His head tilted slightly to the left, the exact same unconscious gesture Dominic made whenever something demanded his full attention. A habit so specific, so uniquely his, that seeing it replicated on the face of a child he'd never met sent a jolt through his nervous system that no amount of discipline could suppress. Twins. Identical. His hands found the railing, gripped it. His knuckles whitened. His breath stopped somewhere between his lungs and his throat, trapped by the sheer impossibility of what he was seeing. His mind, the mind that had built an empire on calculation, analysis, and control, went completely, catastrophically blank. And then a voice cut through the silence. Low, sharp, maternal, carrying the unmistakable authority of a woman who had been the only line of defense around those 2 boys for every single day of their lives. Matteo, Luca, come here. Now. She appeared from behind a cluster of linen-draped tables, moving with the kind of quiet command that could halt a room without raising her volume above a whisper. Her dark hair was swept into a loose chignon that the breeze occasionally disturbed. A pale blue dress, simple but precisely cut, moved against her frame as she walked. Her skin had deepened to a warm bronze under the Mediterranean sun, and there were fine lines at the corners of her eyes, not from age, but from years. Years of laughter she'd created alone. Years of worry she'd carried alone. Years of bedtime stories and school mornings and midnight fevers navigated without the presence of the man now frozen above her on the upper terrace. Lena Moreau. She hadn't seen him yet. Her entire focus was locked on her sons, who were jogging toward her with undiminished grins. She crouched as they reached her, one hand smoothing Matteo's windswept hair, the other adjusting Luca's collar, her fingers moving with the instinctive precision of a mother whose hands had memorized these exact gestures through 8 years of repetition. She was not the woman Dominic remembered. That woman had been brilliant but uncertain, passionate but searching. This woman had been forged, tempered by single motherhood, by solitude, by the daily act of being everything to 2 small human beings who deserved the world. She was stronger now, harder in some places, softer in others. And watching her from above, watching her hold the children he didn't know he had, children who carried his face in her fire, Dominic felt something collapse inside him that would never reassemble the same way. He was watching the life he should have lived, playing out without him, complete without him. Then Luca tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mama, that man is staring at us." Lena's head lifted. Her eyes tracked upward, following her son's small pointing finger, past the terrace stairs, past the balustrade, until they found the steel-gray gaze of the man standing motionless at the railing. Time didn't slow. It stopped entirely. Every memory, every wound, every whispered promise and broken vow compressed into a single, searing second that stretched across the terrace like a wire pulled taut. Her expression didn't change immediately. First came recognition, fast, involuntary, a flicker behind her irises like a match struck in a dark room. Then something harder followed, something practiced. Armor she had spent 9 years forging, being pulled back into place with the speed of someone who had always known this moment might come and had prepared for it the way soldiers prepare for ambush. Her lips parted, then pressed together. Her shoulders squared. She drew both boys closer, one against each hip, her hands tightening almost imperceptibly on their shoulders. Now, I need you to pause for a second and really think about this moment. Imagine coming face to face with someone who shattered your world, someone you spent years healing from, years rebuilding without, and they're standing right there 10 feet away staring at the children they never knew existed. The children they chose not to be there for. What would you do? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to hear it. And if this story is already pulling you in, smash that like button, because what happens next between these two is going to shake you. Dominic descended the terrace stairs slowly. Each step was deliberate, measured, not with his usual executive confidence, but with the care of a man approaching something sacred and dangerous in equal measure. His legs felt disconnected from the rest of him, moving on instinct while his mind remained locked in free fall. He reached the lower terrace and stopped, 5 feet from her, close enough to see the rapid pulse at her throat, far enough to respect the invisible wall she had already erected between them, a wall built not from stone but from 9 years of silence, of nights spent alone, of questions she had answered for their sons without his help. Lena. Her name in his mouth sounded like a confession, like a prayer spoken by someone who had forgotten the words and was trying to remember them in real time. She looked at him the way one looks at a storm that has already done its damage and has returned years later, disguised as sunlight. Dominic. No warmth, no surprise, just a controlled calm of a woman who had rehearsed this encounter 1,000 times in the mirror of her mind and still wasn't ready for it. The twins watched from behind her, their eyes darting between their mother and the tall stranger with matching curiosity. Mateo's arms tightened around his sailboat. Luca's head tilted again, that exact tilt, as he studied Dominic with an intensity that made the billion-dollar CEO feel like he was the one being evaluated. Mateo spoke first. His voice was small but impossibly clear, carrying across the terrace with the unfiltered directness only children possess. Do you know our mama? The question landed like a wrecking ball swung by an angel. Dominic opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. For the first time in his professional life, a life built on eloquence, persuasion, and verbal precision, words failed him completely. His throat constricted. His eyes stung. He looked at the boy, truly looked, and saw himself reflected back with an innocence he had abandoned long ago. His voice cracked down the middle. I did. A long time ago. Lena's jaw tightened. She crouched down, bringing herself eye level with her sons, her back a deliberate shield between them and the man who stood before her. Boys, go sit at our table. Mama will be there in a moment. But Mama... Now please. They obeyed with reluctance, casting backward glances as they retreated toward a shaded table near the edge of the terrace, half hidden behind a cascade of bougainvillea. Their small forms disappeared behind the flowers, but their eyes, his eyes, lingered in Dominic's vision like afterimages burned into a retina. Lena stood, faced him. Her posture was impeccable, her expression composed, but her hands, clasped together in front of her dress, trembled with a vibration so faint that only someone who had once known every inch of her body would notice it. You don't get to do this, she said, her voice low enough that only he could hear. Not here, not like this. Are they mine? The question dropped between them like a stone into still water. Ripples spread outward, through her expression, through her composure, through the carefully maintained architecture of the life she had built without him. She didn't answer immediately. She studied him, searching for something behind those steel-gray eyes, sincerity perhaps, or the absence of it. You lost the right to ask that question 9 years ago, she said finally, and her whisper carried the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights, of 1,000 mornings waking up alone in a bed that used to hold 2. When you called our child an inconvenience, when you walked out of that apartment, when you chose a meeting in London over the future growing inside me, Each word was precise, surgical, not designed to wound, designed to testify. You want to know what you missed, Dominic? She took a half step closer, her voice dropping further. Their first steps, a rainy Tuesday in Marseille. I was alone, no one to call, no one to celebrate with. I recorded it on a phone with a cracked screen and watched it 17 times that night because there was no one else to show it to. His chest tightened, their first word, Mama, because there was no other name to learn. His vision blurred. Their first day of school, two small hands gripping mine because there wasn't a second pair of hands to hold. I walked them to the gate and smiled until they couldn't see me anymore, and then I sat in my car and sobbed for 40 minutes. Dominic's shoulders dropped. The weight of every word pressed into him like gravity doubled, tripled, became unbearable. He didn't defend himself. He didn't try to explain. He simply stood there, absorbing the truth of what his absence had cost, letting it land without resistance. Lena's eyes glistened, but she did not cry. She had cried enough over this man. She had spent years converting those tears into steel. Matteo builds things, she continued, and now her voice shifted, from testimony to something fiercer. Pride. Towers, bridges, circuits. He takes things apart just to understand how they work. He redesigned his school's recycling system at 7 years old. His teacher called me in because she thought he was cheating. He wasn't. He was just smarter than the assignment. A ghost of a smile crossed her lips before vanishing. Luca reads everything. He finished a 400-page novel last week that most adults would struggle with. He narrates stories to imaginary audiences. He asks questions I don't always know how to answer. About the universe, about justice, about why some people leave and don't come back. That last phrase landed like a blade slipped quietly between ribs. They are extraordinary, Dominic, and they are mine. They're ours. The word hung in the salt air. Fragile, defiant, audacious in its claim. Lena's eyes hardened. You don't get to claim what you refuse to hold. A long charged silence stretched between them. The kind of silence that isn't empty but overfull, stuffed to the seams with everything unsaid, unfelt, unforgiven. Dominic opened his mouth to speak, but before the words could form, a figure approached from the club's interior. He was tall, warm-eyed, unhurried. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who belonged exactly where he was. In one hand, he carried 2 juice boxes. In the other, a slim children's book with a colorful cover. Lena, everything okay? His voice was calm, protective, and devastatingly familiar, not to Dominic, but to the scene. This man was not a stranger here. He was a fixture. His name was Raphael Marin. He walked past Dominic without confrontation, without posturing, and moved directly toward the boys' table behind the bougainvillea. Matteo and Luca greeted him with easy smiles, the kind of smiles children reserve for people they trust completely. Luca took the book and immediately began flipping through it. Matteo accepted his juice box and launched into an animated explanation about the structural integrity of toy sailboats, gesturing wildly with both hands. Raphael listened, nodded, laughed at the right moments, asked follow-up questions that made Matteo's eyes light up. There was ease between them. History. The unmistakable texture of shared routines, bedtime stories, Saturday morning pancakes, school pickups, homework arguments, all the invisible architecture of daily life that doesn't make headlines but holds everything together. Dominic watched this exchange, and something inside him, something deeper than pride, deeper than the empire, deeper than the carefully constructed identity he had spent 2 decades building, collapsed. It wasn't rage. It wasn't jealousy. It was something far worse. It was the realization that the space he had left empty had not remained empty. Someone else had filled it. Not by force, not by deception, simply by showing up, day after day after day. While Dominic was conquering markets and collecting accolades and sleeping in penthouses that echoed with silence, this man had been present, steady, available. This man had done the one thing Dominic had refused to do. He had stayed. Lena turned to Raphael. "We should go," she said quietly. Raphael glanced at Dominic. Just once, a measured, unhurried look that contained no hostility, no challenge, no territorial posturing. It was worse than all of those things. It was understanding, the look of a man who knew exactly who Dominic was, who understood exactly what this moment meant, and who had already made peace with all of it long ago. They began to leave. Lena's hand found Matteo's shoulder. Raphael carried Luca's book. The four of them moved together toward the club's exit with the coordinated rhythm of a unit, a family, a life fully formed. And then, just before they disappeared around the corner, both boys turned. They looked back at Dominic. Matteo raised his hand in a small wave, instinctive, innocent, offered the way children offer kindness, without calculation, without agenda. Luca simply watched him for a long moment, with those steel-gray eyes. Then he turned and followed his mother into the sunlight. Dominic stood alone on the terrace. Around him the gala preparations continued, flowers being arranged in crystal vases, tables being draped in white linen, champagne being uncorked with soft celebratory pops. A world preparing to celebrate, and at its center, a man who had never felt more hollowed out in his entire life. Now let me ask you something real. Have you ever watched someone else step into a role that should have been yours? Not because they stole it, not because they schemed or plotted or took anything by force, but because you walked away from it? Because you left a space vacant, and life, being what it is, filled it with someone willing to do what you weren't? That kind of pain doesn't come from what was taken. It comes from what was given up. And it is the sharpest edge in the human experience. If this story is hitting close to home, if it's stirring something in your chest that you can't quite name, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes the stories that hurt the most are the ones that heal the deepest. Now, what Dominic does next is where this story takes a turn that nobody expected. That evening, Dominic Ashford did something he had never done in his career. He didn't show up. The Solaire Gala commenced without its keynote speaker. 300 guests filled the grand terrace. Champagne towers glittered under string lights. A string quartet played Vivaldi. Marco, Dominic's assistant, stood backstage with a tablet and a growing sense of dread, calling his boss's phone every 4 minutes. Each call went to voicemail. Dominic sat in his hotel suite, 6 floors above the celebration. Lights off, curtains open. Below him, the gala shimmered, music and laughter drifting upward through the warm night air. The world was continuing without him, celebrating without him, functioning perfectly in his absence. Exactly the way Lena's world had functioned for 9 years. He pulled out his phone, not to return Marco's calls. He opened his portfolio, the digital architecture of his empire. Stock values, acquisition timelines, patent filings, press summaries, revenue projections. Billions arranged in neat columns. Numbers that had once given him a sense of power now stared back at him with cold indifference. Every zero in every account suddenly read as exactly what it was, a digit that could not love him back. He set the phone face down on the table and stared at the harbor. He thought about his father, Gregory Ashford, a man who had worked 80-hour weeks building a mid-level tech firm into a national company, a man who missed every school play, every birthday dinner, every Saturday morning, a man who had died at his desk at 59, heart attack, midway through a quarterly report, leaving behind a considerable fortune and a 17-year-old son who had learned, through years of observation, exactly one lesson. Work is what matters. Everything else is a distraction. Dominic had carried that lesson like scripture. He had built his entire identity on it. He had used it to justify leaving Paris, to justify the silence, to justify the cold clinical calculation that a child, his children, would derail the trajectory he had planned for himself. But sitting in the dark now, the gala glittering below him like a universe he no longer belonged to, Dominic realized something that struck him with the force of revelation. He hadn't just repeated his father's mistake. He had perfected it. His father, at least, had been in the building, had been down the hall, had been close enough that young Dominic could sometimes hear his voice through the study door, even if it was always on a phone call, always talking to someone more important. Dominic hadn't even given his sons a door to listen through. Something broke inside him. Not dramatically, not with a sound. Quietly, like a bone that has carried a fracture for years, held together by muscle and habit and willpower, finally giving way under the weight of its own pretending. He put his head in his hands, and for the first time in his adult life, in a dark hotel room overlooking a party thrown in his honor, Dominic Ashford wept, not for what he had lost, for what he had chosen to lose. The next morning arrived with the indifferent beauty mornings always carry, regardless of what happened the night before. The Mediterranean was glass still. The sky was pale and faultless. Seabirds traced lazy circles above the harbor. Dominic sat at a small cafe on the marina, unshaven, sleepless, wearing yesterday's shirt with the collar undone. A cup of espresso sat untouched before him, its surface long since gone cold. On the table beside it lay a sealed envelope, cream-colored, his handwriting on the front. Lena. Inside was a letter, not a plea, not a strategy, not a billionaire's attempt to buy absolution. Just words. The most honest words he had ever assembled. An apology without conditions. An acknowledgement without excuses. He didn't ask to be let in. He didn't ask for another chance. He simply told her, for the first time, that she had been right about everything. That he had been afraid. That his fear had cost him the only thing that ever mattered. He planned to leave it at the club's front desk and take the first flight out of Monaco. It was the least he could do, and probably the most she would accept. He was reaching for the envelope when he heard it. Shouting, near the docks. Then a scream, high, sharp, maternal, that cut through the morning calm like a siren through silence. He was on his feet before his mind registered why. A crowd was gathering at the edge of the low pier adjacent to the marina. People were pointing downward, toward the water. A woman, Lena, was on her knees at the pier's edge, reaching down, her voice cracking with a terror that no amount of strength could contain. Matteo had fallen. The boy had been playing near the edge, climbing the wooden railing the way 8-year-olds climb everything, with fearless disregard for consequence, and had slipped. He was in the water, now conscious but panicking, caught against a barnacle-crusted pylon by the current. A gash on his forehead bled freely, turning the salt water around him pink. Raphael was already pulling off his shoes, moving toward the edge, but the angle was wrong. The pylon was too close to the pier's support structure, creating a narrow gap that an adult couldn't easily reach from above. The current, though gentle, was persistent, pressing the boy against the rough wood. Matteo's hands scrambled for grip. His cries were sharp, breathless, swallowed intermittently by water that lapped at his chin. Dominic didn't think. For the first time in his meticulously planned, endlessly strategized, obsessively controlled life, Dominic Ashford acted on pure instinct. He moved through the crowd without seeing it. His jacket hit the dock. His shoes were kicked off mid-stride. He was in the water before anyone fully processed what had happened, including himself. The cold hit him like a wall. Salt stung his eyes. The current tugged at his clothes, but he had already found the pylon, already wrapped one arm around its base, already reached the boy. Matteo was trembling violently, his small body pressed against the wood, his eyes wide with the primal fear that comes from understanding, for the first time, that the world can hurt you. Dominic pulled him close, shifted his body between the boy and the pylon, shielding Matteo's head with his forearm, absorbing the barnacle's bite against his own skin. He could feel the boy's heartbeat, hummingbird fast, frantic, hammering against his chest. "I've got you," he said, and his voice, to his own astonishment, was calm, steady, not the voice of a CEO addressing shareholders, the voice of something far older and far more essential. "I've got you. You're safe. Hold on to me." Matteo's hands, small, cold, trembling, gripped Dominic's shirt with both fists. He held on with the desperate, total trust that children extend only to the people who make them feel safe in the most terrifying moments. Dominic guided him to the ladder. Hands reached down from the pier. He lifted Matteo upward, carefully, carefully, and the crowd pulled the boy onto the dock. Then Dominic climbed up after him, water streaming from his clothes, blood from a dozen small cuts on his forearm mixing with the salt water dripping from his sleeves. He knelt beside Matteo immediately, pulled off what remained of his jacket, and pressed it against the gash on the boy's forehead. His hands were steady, surgeon steady, even as his heart fractured along every fault line it had accumulated over 9 years of absence. "You're okay," he murmured, his face close to Matteo's. "Look at me, right here. You're okay. I'm not going anywhere." The ambulance arrived in 7 minutes. Dominic rode with them. He didn't ask permission. Lena, white-faced and shaking, climbed in beside them without stopping him. There was no room in her terror for gatekeeping. There was only room for the fact that this man she had every right to hate, had just pulled her son from the water without a second's hesitation. In the ambulance, Dominic held his son's hand for the first time. Matteo's fingers, sandy, trembling, streaked with diluted blood, wrapped around his and held on with a grip that said more than any word in any language. And Dominic held back, gently, fiercely, with everything he had. 7 stitches, mild concussion, overnight observation. The doctor delivered the verdict with the cheerful efficiency of someone who had seen far worse. Matteo was already sitting up in bed, examining his stitches with more fascination than fear, asking the nurse if the scar would look cool. She assured him it would. Lucas sat in the waiting room, quiet and watchful, reading a book Raphael had retrieved from their hotel. He turned pages steadily, but his eyes occasionally drifted toward the door to his brother's room, tracking every adult who entered and exited with the vigilant gravity of a child who understood more than he revealed. Raphael had stepped outside to make phone calls and arrange logistics, giving Lena and Dominic the space that the moment required. It was, Dominic would later reflect, one of the most generous acts he had ever witnessed, precisely because it was offered without fanfare, without acknowledgement, without expectation of gratitude. Lena sat in the corridor outside Mateo's room, her back against the white hospital wall, her knees pulled to her chest. The pale blue dress was wrinkled and salt-stained. Her chignon had come undone, her dark hair spilling across her shoulders. She stared at the opposite wall with the hollow, thousand-yard focus of a woman whose adrenaline had finally receded, leaving behind nothing but exhaustion and the raw, trembling aftermath of almost losing everything. Dominic lowered himself to the floor beside her, slowly, carefully, not touching her, just present. Two people sitting on a cold hospital floor separated by inches and years. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Lena broke, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, the way strong people break, in small fractures that spread across the surface before anyone notices the damage. "Every single day," she whispered, her voice threadbare. "Every single day I do this alone. Every fever at 2 a.m, every nightmare I can't explain away, every scraped knee in school meeting, and question about why they don't have a father at the dinner table." Her breath hitched. "I am so tired, Dominic. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, the kind that lives in your bones." He sat with it. He didn't rush to fill the silence with reassurance. He didn't offer solutions or strategies. He simply let her words exist in the space between them, giving them the weight they deserved. Then, carefully, as though handling something made of glass and gunpowder, he spoke. "I know I can't fix 9 years. I know I can't undo what I chose. I know that every first I missed, every step, every word, every fever, every question, is a debt I will carry for the rest of my life." He paused. His voice dropped lower. "I am not asking for your forgiveness. I haven't earned it. I'm not asking for a place I abandoned. I am asking for a chance to stand at the door, to start from nothing, to prove, not with words, not with money, not with grand gestures, but with presence, that I can stay." Lena turned her head and looked at him. Really looked. The way she used to look at a blank canvas before committing the first brushstroke, searching for the truth beneath the surface, deciding whether what she saw was real enough to risk. Then she said something that Dominic did not expect, something that rearranged every assumption he had made since the terrace. "Raphael is not their father." The words landed softly, but their impact was seismic. "He's my business partner, my closest friend. He has been steady and present and kind to those boys since the day they were born. He drives them to school. He reads to them. He taught Mateo to tie his shoes and taught Luca to ride a bicycle." She swallowed. "But he is not their father. He never tried to be, because I never let him." Dominic's breath caught. "I hated you for leaving," she continued, and her voice trembled on the word hated, as though even now, after everything, the word felt too large for what she actually felt. "But I never replaced you. I couldn't." Her eyes glistened. "They have your eyes, Dominic. Every single morning, I wake up and look at 2 small faces that carry the features of the man who broke my heart. And somehow, that made me love them more." Dominic was undone, completely, irrevocably, not by her anger, which he had expected, not by her strength, which he had witnessed, but by this impossible, agonizing act of preservation. She had kept a space open, not out of hope. She was too practical for that. Not out of weakness, she was too strong, but out of some deeper instinct, a recognition that certain things, once created, cannot be reassigned. That fatherhood is not a role to be filled by audition. That those boys deserve the truth, even if the truth was an empty chair. He reached out, slowly, and placed his hand, palm up, on the cold floor between them. Not grabbing, not pulling, just offering. Lena looked at his hand for a long time. Then, with the caution of someone lowering herself into water whose temperature she doesn't yet trust, she placed her hand in his. They sat like that on the hospital floor, 2 people holding hands in a fluorescent corridor, surrounded by the antiseptic hum of machines and the quiet footsteps of nurses, and the silence between them, for the first time in 9 years, felt like something other than absence. It felt like a beginning. 3 weeks later, a quiet stretch of coast outside Monaco. No yachts, no galas, no empire, just sand, and sun and the sound of waves doing what waves have always done. Arriving, retreating, arriving again, patient beyond measure. Dominic knelt beside a half-finished sandcastle, his sleeves rolled past his elbows, his trousers dusted with sand at the knees. Matteo crouched beside him, examining the western tower with the furrowed concentration of a structural engineer reviewing blueprints. "See, the problem is the foundation ratio," Matteo said, pointing with a small, sandy finger. "The base is too narrow for the height. It's going to collapse if we don't widen the support structure by at least 2 centimeters on each side." Dominic stared at his son, then smiled. A smile that no boardroom had ever produced. No magazine cover, no Forbes feature. A smile that came from somewhere beneath the empire and the armor and the decades of emotional fortification, from the quiet, forgotten room where the man he might have been had waited all along. "You're absolutely right," he said. "Show me how." 3 feet away, Luca sat cross-legged on a towel, a book about marine biology open across his knees. He read aloud in a clear, unhurried voice, occasionally pausing to correct his brother's engineering with scientific observations about tidal patterns and sediment erosion. He used a breadstick as a pointer, tapping the air for emphasis. "Actually, the real problem is tidal reach," Luca announced. "We're building within the intertidal zone. No matter how wide the foundation is, the evening tide will reclaim everything below the high water. Mark," he paused, then added matter-of-factly, "we should relocate the entire structure approximately 4 meters inland." Matteo looked at his brother with the specific brand of irritation only a twin can produce. "Or we could build a seawall. A seawall made of sand. Everything starts somewhere." Dominic laughed. The sound surprised him, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was. He couldn't remember the last time he had laughed without performance, without calculation. This laugh came from somewhere involuntary, somewhere deep and untrained and real. Lena sat on a blanket a few feet away, her knees drawn to her chest, her arms wrapped around them. She watched the 3 of them, this strange, fragile, newborn constellation, with an expression that held equal parts terror and hope. She had not fully let go of her caution. She might never. The walls she had built were not decorative, they were load-bearing. But she had opened a door in one of them, and light was coming through. Matteo looked up from the sandcastle and studied Dominic with the frank appraisal children are capable of, and adults have long since abandoned. "You're really tall," he observed. Dominic smiled again. "You'll be tall, too. How do you know?" "Because you're built like me." The sentence hung in the air. Not heavy, not dramatic. Simple, true. A fact offered without agenda, landing gently between them like a leaf settling on still water. Luca glanced up from his book. His eyes, steel gray, alert, carrying that uncanny depth, moved between Dominic and Matteo, processing something. "Mama says we get things from both sides," he said slowly, carefully, as though testing each word before releasing it. "She says we have her stubbornness and our father's eyes." Silence. The waves continued their ancient rhythm. A gull cried somewhere overhead. The breeze shifted the pages of Luca's book. He looked directly at Dominic, not accusingly, not hopefully, with something far more complex, the quiet, steady gaze of a child who has already assembled the puzzle and is simply waiting for the adults to catch up. "You have the same eyes," Luca said. The air crystallized around them. Lena's hand pressed against her mouth. Matteo looked from Luca to Dominic and back again, his expression shifting from confusion to something luminous and uncertain. Dominic's vision blurred. He blinked, and warmth trailed down his cheek, a sensation so foreign to his adult life that he almost reached up to verify it was real. A billionaire, a titan, a man who had stared down hostile boards and navigated corporate warfare without flinching, brought to tears by an 8-year-old boy with a breadstick and a biology book, and eyes that were unmistakably, irreversibly his own. He didn't wipe the tear away. He let it fall, there in the open, under the wide and witnessing sky. "Yes," he said, his voice barely holding together. "I do." Matteo was quiet for a long moment. Then he placed his hand, small, warm, coated in sand, on Dominic's wrist. The touch was light, unbearably light, and yet it carried the force of everything, every missed birthday, every unanswered question. Every night Lena had tucked them in alone and kissed their foreheads and whispered that they were loved, 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 doing the work of 2 parents with one heart. "Will you help me fix the tower?" Matteo asked. Dominic looked at the crumbling sandcastle, at the boy's hand on his wrist. At Luca, watching from behind his book with quiet, cautious hope. At Lena, whose tears were falling freely now, though she made no sound and no move to stop them. He placed his hand over his son's. "Yes," he whispered. "I'll help you build whatever you need." The sun dipped lower, painting the coast in shades of amber and rose and deep, aching gold. The sandcastle grew, imperfect, lopsided, missing a seawall that Matteo still insisted on and Lucas still dismissed as structurally futile. It was, by any objective measure, a terrible sandcastle. It was the most beautiful thing Dominic Ashford had ever built. The boys eventually abandoned the project for the greater adventure of the shoreline itself, sprinting toward the retreating waves with their arms spread wide, daring the water to catch them. Their laughter rose into the evening air, bright, unstoppable, the sound of children who do not yet know how rare happiness like this is, and who, God willing, wouldn't learn for a very long time. Lena moved closer. Slowly, carefully, she lowered herself onto the sand beside Dominic, close enough that the space between them was no longer a distance, but an invitation. Their shoulders didn't touch, but the gap was narrower than it had been 3 weeks ago, narrower than it had been this morning, narrowing still. "I'm scared," she said softly, watching their sons chase the tide. "So am I," he answered. And in that shared confession, fragile, honest, stripped of every pretense they had ever used to protect themselves from each other, something took root. Not the love they had lost. That love had belonged to two younger, more reckless people, and it could not be resurrected. But something new, something with deeper roots and harder-won soil, something shaped by absence and ache and the unbearable tenderness of knowing exactly how much you stand to lose. Dominic watched his sons, two small silhouettes against the gold-streaked horizon, jumping over waves, arguing about tidal physics, alive and radiant and real, and understood, finally, completely, irreversibly, what his father never learned, what his empire could never teach him, what no amount of wealth or power or strategic brilliance could manufacture. That presence is the only currency that matters. That every minute spent building something that cannot love you back is a minute stolen from someone who can. That the bravest act a human being is capable of is not conquering the world. It is kneeling in the wreckage of your own choices and saying, with nothing to offer but your own broken, beating heart, "I am here now, and I will not leave again." Dominic Ashford built an empire that spanned continents. His name moved markets. His decisions shaped industries. The world measured him by his net worth and found him extraordinary. But the most important thing he ever built was a sandcastle on a quiet beach with two boys who had his eyes and a woman who had every reason to close the door, and chose, against every instinct forged by 9 years of surviving alone, to leave it open. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the people in your life who matter more than any achievement, any title, any number in any account, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Not tomorrow. Today. Because that's the lesson, isn't it? Every moment you wait costs something that money will never buy. And leave a comment telling me, what is the one thing in your life that no amount of success could ever replace? I read every single comment, and I would love to hear your story. Until next time, this is Mr. White, reminding you that the greatest love stories aren't written in boardrooms or on balance sheets. They're written in the moments you choose to stay. And sometimes, the greatest empire a man can build is not made of glass and steel. It is made of sand and salt and the trembling courage to kneel, not before a boardroom, but before the life he almost lost.